Hello, everybody. It's 6 o'clock and welcome to the second part of Engineer Stories, which is part of the series that we've launched for this fall in honor of and in remembrance of 9/11 and the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Twin Towers and the changes to not just Lower Manhattan and New York, but really the world. And that is part of the subject for tonight's expanded view of the impacts of 9/11. If you were here with the first of the Engineer Stories, when we talked about the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Twin Towers, so the hours after the days and then the months and the response by structural engineers, you witnessed their eyewitness accounts of which were emotional and very personal, as well as professional and intellectual, to trying to understand and come to grips with the collapse of the towers and to understand what to do next. So that kind of reactive moment and kind of professional experience that we looked at in the first session is now expanded into a longer timeline. And once again, we have to lead us through this evening, Najib Abboud, who is a managing principal of the firm, the engineering firm, Thornton Tomasetti, head of the applied sciences practice leader. And he led the forensic analysis on the collapse of the towers in the decade that came after 9/11. And joining him in conversation tonight and also in a presentation is Stephen Flynn, who's the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University. And Najib is going to introduce Stephen, who will speak after Najib shares with us his experience of in about 30 minutes or so of the process of the engineering analysis at complicated and as you will see, fascinating, but also horrifying of how we came to understand what really happened in those minutes and hours. So I'm going to introduce Najib and hand things over to him. And he will also give a little fuller introduction of Stephen. And then Najib will share his screen. I will leave the screen. And Najib, if you could come on now, I will stop sharing my screen. And Najib, do you want to turn your video on? I'm not seeing your video, so you'll have to tell me if you're there.
I am here. Thank you very much.
There you are. Okay, there you are. So Najib, do you want to give a little bit of background on Stephen? And before you do that, let me not forget to mention that we hope we'll have time at the end of our 75 minutes to answer some of the questions that you may want to pose in the chat function. So I will gather those. I will have left the screen. I will try to moderate some questions and introduce them into the conversation. And I just want to also remember to say that Najib is a new board member of the Skyscraper Museum, and I happened to meet him about a year ago now when his firm, Thornton Tomasetti, undertook to do an oral history of partners in the firm who had worked especially centrally in organizing TT's efforts, but also some of the across the city structural engineering efforts under a contract with the Department of Design and Construction that TT headed. And if you didn't see that program, I invite you to watch it on the video. But I was enormously moved during those oral histories, about 16 hours or so, that were led by Amy Weinstein of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, where in the kind of fullness of the memory, as well as the kind of intellectual rigor that Najib and others brought to understanding what happened, I came to came to grips with the event of 9/11 and the collapse of the towers in a way that that I never would have imagined otherwise. So I hope we can repeat some of that in the shortened version of 1 hour tonight. So Najib, let me hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Carol. Good evening, everyone. As Carol prefaced, this evening we will be concentrating slightly on the longer term after 9/11, where a whole slew of questions were starting to circulate as to the safety of our urban infrastructure in general, the safety of our country in general, and what's the appropriate approach to it. So today's session, we will examine how we first try to understand how the towers and why the towers collapsed, but also take it then to the longer and broader horizon, and that is Dr. Flynn's specialty, to address how we respond as a society more broadly to disruptions. And he'll introduce some of the concepts that essentially around which we base our current thinking, i.e. the one of resilience. But let me first give you a couple of words on Dr. Flynn. He's the founding director of the Global Resilience Institute at Northeastern University, where he leads a university-wide endeavor to advance societal resilience in the growing face of growing man-made threats as well as natural threats. By training, he's a doctor in political sciences, but he has a joint appointment with the Civil Engineering Department and the School of Public Policy, which is a very interesting intersection in my mind. And it came to the fore in the days after 9/11, where how do we translate engineering concepts to broker a broader conversation with society as a whole around the concept of risk and managing the risk and being resilient in the face of risk as a society, not just as infrastructure assets. So it's the entire collection of physical infrastructure, people who occupy it, people who manage it, and the country as a whole. But at the time, just after a couple of years after 9/11, I met Dr. Flynn when he was a senior fellow at the for National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. And both of us in very different capacities were trying to address issues arising from 9/11. I from an engineering perspective, Steve from a policy perspective, trying to advise both the federal government as well as the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And as we came to speak, we realized that there is a gap between the engineering conversation and the public policy conversation. And we decided to do something about it. And it's been extremely fruitful, at least to my own intellectual development, to have that continued dialogue with Steve over the last 20 years. It's difficult to say, it's enriching, yet it has its genesis in a pretty dramatic event, 9/11. So without further delay, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I'll take you through a presentation as to how we approached the investigation of what happened to the towers on 9/11. So after the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when everyone was concerned with the search and rescue operation that clearly took the front page in terms of the attention of the country as a whole, if not the world. But soon thereafter, there were questions that started to arise, notably, are we safe? Are all of our buildings vulnerable? Is our entire urban infrastructure vulnerable? I recall vividly people having conversations about maybe everyone should be leaving New York City. Maybe everyone should be leaving urban centers. Interestingly enough, 20 years later, we had somewhat similar thoughts around COVID, though not exactly the same. So there was a crying need to understand exactly what happened, to be able to address what is our vulnerability and how the towers collapse. Of course, I won't indulge in the conversation around all of the conspiracy theories, but part of how we address that fear and the irrationality of some of the ideas is through a scientific investigation. So I give you the timeline on the screen over what happened. You have the first impact on the North Tower at 8:46, second impact barely 20 minutes later on the South Tower. The second tower to be impacted is the first one to collapse, literally 56 minutes later. The first tower to be impacted only collapses about 102 minutes after impact. And the third tower that was not hit by an airplane, WTC-7, collapses at the end of the day at around 5 p.m. So at the same time, in response to that trauma and, of course, litigation, and for those that attended last week's panel, you heard what it took, all of the drama around reaching the decision of how to rebuild that site and what should be rebuilt, what should not be rebuilt. You heard the narrative of all of the different stakeholders and the raw feelings, if you will, around it all. But there was a money issue. Where do we get the money to rebuild that site? So obviously there was a litigation. That litigation compelled one of the list of 5 major studies that I've listed on the screen. It is the second one, is the World Trade Center structural engineering investigation that Thornton Tomasetti and Weidlinger led. The first report was issued in August 2002, yet that was just the beginning. Addenda report, follow-on report, associated reports by others continued to be issued for the subsequent few years. Then the National Institute of Standard and Technology, the official body mandated by Congress to investigate all collapses starting with 9/11, issued its first report in September 2005 concerning the towers collapses, the Twin Towers. After that, in 2008, they issued a report around WTC-7, the building that collapsed due to the fires without being impacted by an airplane, though it was impacted by debris from the collapses of the Twin Towers. Then we issued yet another report in October 2015, and also investigating the collapse of WTC-7. In general, my statement is simple. There isn't a single collapse of a building or a piece of engineering that I can think of that's been as investigated at this collapse. So we really have much more information about it than literally any other accident that has that piece of infrastructure suffered. So I think it's important to understand, and that's not part necessarily of the public narrative, as to the sheer amount of investigation and brains and totally independent bodies. So this is not the voice of one side. This is the voice of many scientists and engineers from different groups looking at it. And I would say at the end of the day, the conclusions largely are converge around certain specific findings that I'll mention at the end. But as I said, so I'll speak to our investigation, and I really, because of time, only speak to a subset of it. All kinds of questions needed to be addressed. But because there was a litigation, whether this was a single event or 2 events, that largely speaks to whether the insurance payout would be 3.2 billion or up to twice that amount. We needed to address whether the collapse of the South Tower caused or contributed to the collapse of the North Tower. But really, this is a surrogate for us to understand the precise causes and mechanisms of the collapses. There were all other questions that were asked that we addressed too, but I'll just focus on that first question today. So clearly, we could see exactly the damage that was sustained on the outside perimeter wall of the towers. That was the beginning of the time where the public had access to high quality digital cameras. And it is amazing the quality and the number of photography that we managed to aggregate post 9/11 to aid in that investigation. It is unprecedented. But no photography could tell us what's happening on the inside. For that, we needed to undertake a series of simulations, but these are not reenactments. These are actually extremely detailed physics-based calculations that allow us to see the progression of damage and of the events inside of the tower with one time. Now, more than one hypothesis is possible and was investigated. But once you constrain it by what physics allows and the exterior observable events, like this photo you see on your screen, we come down to a single most likely plausible course of events. And that's what I'll present to you. So how do we go about doing such investigation? First thing, for the collapse of the North Tower, there was a single video that captured the impact on the North Tower, which is, you just saw a snippet of it. Now, if you think about trying to triangulate where did the airplane come from and at what speed, a single video is clearly not enough. You need typically two. But we made use of the fact that that video had an audio recording, and we could hear the frequency shift as the airplane went behind the building that you see to your right. That happens to be an AT&T building. Using those two pieces of information, we are able to arrive at pretty good estimates of the impact speed. 500 miles an hour, this is cruising altitude speed. The North Tower impact is pretty much head-on. It engaged 4 floors between 94 to 98, but otherwise it is centrally going through the center of the building without much of a rolling angle, right? So this is the first piece of information for us to start being able to understand what happens once that airplane goes into the tower. As I said, we are able to ascertain what happened to the exterior of the tower down to graphic details. This image, and I don't zoom into it anymore because it still shows survivors that were on those floors at that time. But the level of detail that is in that photo allows us for a very accurate assessment down to what's happening at every connection of every beam, every column. But in order for us to understand what's happening inside, we need to build these extremely detailed model of airplanes. Of course, the only place those come from is from the Department of Defense, because such airplanes have a defense version of it, if you will. And we had consulted for the Department of Defense on airplane crashes before, so we had access to such detailed model. And as you can see on the screen, we're talking about a pretty sophisticated model. Once we take the model of the airplane and impact it at the speed that we determined before, we see what happens to the inside of the tower. We're looking top down at a given floor. And it is interesting to understand what that is telling us. It is telling us that the airplane does not penetrate whole. It has a thin aluminum skin. So the minute it breaches the perimeter wall of the building, it's converted into an incredible flow of debris, very damaging debris. These are pieces of metal flying at 500 miles an hour, but it's more akin to a power wash, if you will, than to imagine a plane going in whole into the building. Of course, some of the columns in the center of the building, in the core, you see them getting severed. So if I am to summarize very quickly what happens to the building, the exterior perimeter of the building, about half of that face is severed over about 4 floors. The concrete slabs are only damaged in the immediate vicinity of the impact. It's not a failure beyond that, which some people had postulated. You will see in the center of the core of the building, in the red zone, columns are severed. But ultimately, what proves much more lethal is that big regions that are highlighted in yellow in a second are regions where columns survived but got stripped of their fireproofing by that flow of debris across the space. And ultimately, it is the fire that brings down the building. And notionally, you can intuitively understand that the columns were severed in the first few milliseconds and the tower stood. So the towers could sustain the loss of the columns in the red region. But after that, for the rest of the duration, fire is attacking the rest. Just to give you a sense of the violence of that impact, this is a model of just the engine of the airplane penetrating the exterior perimeter wall of the towers. If you calculate how much energy is left in that engine after it's penetrated the exterior wall, it's only exhausted 15% of its momentum. So it still has 85% of damaging potential, if you will. That is just to display the violence of that attack. People talked in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 that the construction of the Twin Towers was so light that there was a wholesale failure of the slabs. That did not occur, right? And we have the investigations that you see on the right screen. By looking at the pattern of the smoke being exhausted from the fires, we can tell, in addition to having photography, that the slabs are in place. So for all of the innovation that was introduced in the towers in the 70s, they are a marvel of engineering. All the innovation, all of the first ever that people questioned after 9/11 as being potentially the fatal flaw, ultimately the investigation revealed they were not a fatal flaw. Now, the fire that started by having the fuel disperse across entire floors and light up simultaneously, the temperatures reached are no different than a regular office fire. What is different about them is the simultaneous nature of them across multiple floors and up to 4 floors. That's one. People talk about an explosion that arose from the south side of the North Tower. That is more like an aerosol can mist that you inflame. It's a deflagration, not an explosion. That consumed about 1/3 of the fuel. 1/3 dispersed on the impact floor and started the fires. The last third went down the core of the building, and that is why you hear stories of fires erupting in the lobby at the base of the towers. Also, what is special about those towers is that they had that outrigger hat truss at the very top of the building. What was its function? Its function was to stiffen a little bit the towers because under heavy winds, they would sway, and they would sway up to 10 feet, right? So this hat truss was meant to stiffen the top so that they sway less. I know you think it's dramatic for a tower to sway by 10 feet, but the human body responds more to acceleration rather than to the extent of sway. And it doesn't mean it's unsafe, it's perfectly safe. But those trusses also carried the two major Manhattan TV, the one of the two major broadcast TV antennas in Manhattan. But on 9/11, they had a life-saving role. As you can see, that hat truss connects all of the interior columns to the exterior perimeter columns. So what happened? Before impact, if we think of green as good, red is bad, yellow is in between. Those towers are designed to sustain hurricane winds. We're talking over 100 miles an hour winds. Well, on 9/11, the winds were below 10 miles an hour. So you have excess capacity, structural capacity, that is being untapped. The airplanes hit. Immediately after it, if you look on the left picture, you see the stresses are redistributed around the injury on the outside wall. As massive as it is, you get some stress concentrations at the edges, but the towers redistribute the loads very well. In the core, on the right pictures, you see some columns missing. Well, now you have up to 20 floors dangling along those columns that were severed. Their weight, instead of being sent down to the foundations, is hanging off of the truss. The truss then distributes that load to columns that are still found unsevered, and their weight goes down to foundation. That is why the tower stabilized immediately after the impact, and that is what essentially enabled the safe evacuation of the entire population that was below the impact zones in both towers. Our death toll was primarily people that were above the impact zone and that couldn't evacuate, and the first responders that rushed in to try to help the survivors and help with the evacuation. Of course, 102 minutes later, the fires continuously weakened the steel. Steel at those temperatures doesn't melt, it just weakens. So think about at 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel is half as weak or half as strong as it is at ambient temperature, at normal temperature. When the temperatures here reach up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel has lost 80% of its strength. So clearly the core is being weakened, and the hat truss is working harder and harder to try to shed the load onto surviving columns, but ultimately there's simply not enough capacity in the tower, and the collapse initiates. That is the collapse of the North Tower. You can see it core driven in the center first, and then the outside perimeter wall follow. So how do I know that this physics calculation is meaningful? We overlay it on actual video footage on the day, and keep your eye on the TV antenna at the top, and you'll see it starts coming down exactly the way the analysis predicted the collapse happened. The overlay of the calculation and the observable events is, amazingly good. The South Tower, I won't go through the whole investigation of the South Tower, but the South Tower impact was eccentric. And that's why the South Tower first tipped at the top, but then gravity is the single strongest force that governs a collapse. Once that tip occurs, the rest is simply coming down. It's a pancaking event floor over floor over floor, until you just have a massive rubble at the bottom. So when people talk about this looks like an implosion, yes, a building collapses, a building of that height always collapses that way. It never tips over sideways. That's cartoons, that's not physics. That's the mere force of gravity. People who induce implosions, all they look to do is to weaken columns such that gravity does most of the work. In this case, the airplane attack did something similar. And the subsequent fires weakened columns, and ultimately gravity takes over. So I know I rushed through an investigation that lasted 10 years across the 3 towers, but it allowed us to speak with knowledge to some of the public questions beyond just the litigation. The Twin Towers were well designed, extremely well maintained, beyond what is customary in high-rise buildings. We understand exactly why and how the collapse happened. It is not just the airplane impact, it is the fire attacking and diminishing the residual remaining strength in those towers. And they had lost their ability to resist the fire because they got stripped of their fireproofing by that power wash from the debris of the airplane. We understand where the collapse initiated, how it initiated, and why it fell, and the differences in the collapse mechanism between the South Tower and the North Tower. So in some sense, for us to be able to understand how we look at other buildings or future buildings, it was critically important for us to be able to understand what happened here. So now that we are 20 years later, some of the normal questions one would ask: did we change how we design and build towers, especially skyscrapers? The answer is yes. We learned a lot from 9/11, the way engineers have historically always learned from failures. Even when things were done well, there's always a lesson to be extracted. Tangibly, the lessons that were adopted in future buildings is man-made attacks are part of the profile of what we consider in the design of high-rise buildings. Evacuation and means of egress are part of explicitly what we are designing, thinking of events of this nature. Does it mean that we design for plane attacks? The simple answer is no. Could we? Potentially we could, but no one wants to live in a bunker in the sky or work in a bunker in the sky, right? It is the same reason, and that's part of our daily experience. When each one of us gets into a car and drives, we know that we are not perfectly safe. We are taking a measured risk just because we grow up seeing car accidents, seeing mangled cars, probably knowing somebody who was injured or died in a car accident. Yet most of us don't bring that thinking to buildings because no one talked to us about it, unfortunately. And there is a communication gap between how engineers work and what the public at large is aware of. So no, we do not design for plane attacks because it's not part of what is desirable, or at least that is the current risk profile of what we believe the urban environment chooses to be. So when we talk about are we perfectly safe, and that is where I would like to take the whole discussion of our concept of security, how it evolved from 9/11 until today, and where the concept of resilience started overlapping with security and ultimately overtaking that thinking. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Steve Flynn
Najib, you just hit your mute button there as well.
So yeah, please go ahead, Steve. It's yours to address the next half.
Okay, outstanding. Thank you so very much. And it's a real privilege to be here back with Najib for this great and important event. So my role is, as Najib laid out here, I'm the non-engineer in this mix here. I spend a lot of time with engineers, but my my academic training is as a political scientist with a particular focus on international security studies. And on 9/11, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations, which is located on 68th and Park Avenue in New York City. I arrived that morning on a commuter train, like so many folks who work in the city do, at about 8:35, and at the Grand Central Station, and took my number 6 train up to 68th and Lexington and walked the block to the council. When I got to my office, my neighbor had a TV on, and it was around 9:05. And at that point, we together watched the second plane fly into the South Tower. I had, preceding this, been working on a commission that was launched in 1998 by President Clinton to look at national security in the context of the end of the Cold War. Surprisingly, it took 9 years for the government to kind of get around to saying, hey, the world has changed. We might need to think about national security. And the instruments we built to provide national security need to adapt perhaps to the new realities that we're going to be seeing as we roll into the new millennia. And so 2 distinguished senators, former Gary Hart and Warren Rudman, came together with a blue ribbon commission. Back when we did bipartisanship, we had both equal number of Republicans and Democrats, very experienced national security professionals, and a staff, one of which I was brought on to support, to look at the national security environment. The goal of the commission was to provide a report to the new president. There would be a new one, we knew, in January 2001, because President Clinton would be completing his second term, and provide this new president with a survey of what was believed to be the national security environment we would be facing, and some recommendations about how the national security apparatus of the United States would need to adjust to that. The top finding of that report, which was rolled out in January of 2001, was that the greatest national security challenge that will confront the United States in the new millennia will be a catastrophic terrorist attack on our soil. And there was a series of recommendations to address the reality that the commission also pointed out, which was we were woefully unprepared for dealing with that reality, or that eventuality. And spent the next several months trying to get some attention of people on the Hill, the new Bush administration. And so when this event actually played out, the tragic events of 9/11, my reaction was, and I don't remember saying it entirely, but my assistant who was there said, my first response when I saw the second plane fly in was to say, well, here it is. And so while we're all surprised and shocked by what happened, for me, unfortunately, it was not a surprise that it did happen. A lot of the focus that I had in dealing with the issue of terrorism, and I served on the National Security Council staff in the mid-90s, was how we would react to acts of terrorism, and specifically how we might overreact to acts of terrorism. And this was the genesis of this focus around the concept of resilience that I want to spend some time with talking with you today, essentially taking this tragic event of 9/11 and how this has redefined how I argue we should be thinking about the issues of safety, but especially of security. First, the overarching point here to be made is security is never an end unto itself, nor is safety an end unto itself. Sometimes our rhetoric, though, gets in the way of that. After 9/11, federal agencies were then sort of people from the Bush administration, others who are sort of on the front lines from a policy standpoint, national security, had this regular refrain where they would say, we have to be right 100% of the time, and the terrorists have to be right only once. I used to cringe at this and call folks out occasionally and say, What have we ever been right 100% of the time doing in our life? You know, you're inflating expectations that you simply can't deliver on. And what we have to do is manage the risk. We have to manage the risk of terrorism, as we have to manage risk that we look at through safety. And we would be perfectly secure if we lived in a world where, as Najib highlighted here, if we were living in a bunker. That is probably not the world we want to live in. The core concept of resilience that I want to share with you here is that it really says, so let's get us think about, well, what are we trying to secure? Are things that we value. One things we value are things like mobility, as the example of we get in cars and accept some risk, because what we're trying to do is, of course, be mobile and to get to where we want to go. We expect that there are ways in which risk as it manifests itself are addressed, and we set different rules. We try to discourage drunken driving. We try to design roads well. We put safety features in our car. But our goal in doing that is to basically make us confident enough that we will use these vehicles surrounded by perfect strangers who are hurling at high speeds. We'll do this because we see a benefit of mobility. We want to communicate. You know, we need energy. We need the basic ingredients of our of modernity, and all of them carry some level of risk. So I'm going to share my screen with just a few slides to sort of start to tell this story. And what I'm trying to leave, hopefully useful for our conversation this evening, is to move beyond the concept of security and begin to think about how resilience can be our ultimate goal. I came to this work pre 9/11, and this was actually something I discussed before the US Commission on National Security, focusing on this risk. This is actually something the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, who built, of course, the World Trade Center, also owns. It's Liberty International Airport, you're seeing on the left. And running down the middle, you see the runways for the airport, but then the New Jersey Turnpike. And then you see the railhead that runs adjacent to the Jersey Pike. And then you see the Port Elizabeth Container Terminal, which is the largest container terminal on the East Coast. This is an extraordinary bit of engineering. Where we're trying to do, of course, is to assure transportation and the mobility it provides across multiple modes, from a ship to a train to a truck, to vehicles, to planes, all within a space of a little over a mile. And the drive to get the efficiencies that come from this co-locating all this capacity. So the big colorful boxes that you see on a ship or on the back of a truck, an 18-wheeler, can move almost effortlessly from a train to a plane to a ship and to a truck. All this is concentrated in this very little space. But my security background had me looking at this and asking the question, isn't there some fragility here? Because if I disrupt this one location, the impact would be terrible, not just for Newark, but it would cascade across not just the metro New York region, but in fact, all of New England, because this essentially is the neck that feeds all the transportation logistics for the Northeastern part of the United States. And there is some vulnerability built here in that there's not a lot of to safeguard. So I was looking at this challenge in the 1990s as an issue of security and how do we think about dealing with risk in the context of our dependency on mobility and logistics, transportation. And the key here is how I think about managing it as a system. So resilience defined at the end of the Obama administration is actually one that survived the administration of the Trump administration, and is still with us with the Biden administration. But key to it is the idea that we're basically, before something gets disrupted, we want to be prepared for it. We understand the risk, we want to prepare for it. After something happens, we don't want to bounce back, we want to bounce forward. We want to adapt and build back better and smarter. But we should design things to withstand a risk up to a certain point. We should be prepared to recover nimbly. And we should be looking at it through a whole range of hazards, because the things that we do for one hazard may in fact create more fragility against another hazard. What I argue is animating the resilience imperative, captured on a micro scale by the story we saw with Newark, is that we've become hyper-connected. What this does is it transforms the impact of risk when it plays out on, as it inevitably does, when a hazard plays out, in ways that are profoundly more disruptive and costly. Because every time we make a connection, we create a dependency. And when we make multiple connections, we create interdependencies. So what used to be a local shock now can impact and cascade in far more disruptive ways. The estimates before COVID hit is that we're running a tab of close to $500 billion a year from hazards. Now, it's not that we haven't had earthquakes or volcanoes or hurricanes. Now we know with climate change, we're seeing more frequent, more intense weather events, but it is when those events impact on us, they are far more disruptive than they have been in the past. And we're layering on top of this more connectivity with the Internet of Things. From a space of from about 2007, when we virtually never connected physical objects to the net, where estimates by 4 years from now will be at about 38 billion. Everything from our refrigerator to our smartphones, talking to our cars, everything's connected, but those connections again create dependencies and interdependencies and create the risk, therefore, of cascading failure if we don't think about how we deal with issues of safety, security, and ultimately resilience. So this captures the story of the Internet of Things. At its core, another way to capture this is that part of our challenge with interdependency is systems that were often built for a specific purpose, for power, to provide power, provide transportation, to provide fuel or communications. Over time, we've engineered these so that they are constantly interacting with one another. So there's a level of tremendous mutual dependence and interdependence. And so if we lose power, there's one that's most obvious for us, it cascades and impacts on transportation, on emergency services. If there's no power, you can't run a compressor station that moves natural gas down its line to ultimately be able to provide that fuel. Our communications ability starts to fail. Our water systems rely on energy. And if we have no water, we probably don't have any way to cool a power plant, and that therefore may lead to it coming down. As we saw with the story just this past winter, with the failure of the Texas power grid, its really biggest impact was loss of water and the impact that even had on providing medical help and health services at a time when we were trying to treat people with COVID. In Puerto Rico, we saw this really play out in Hurricane Maria, this risk of cascading effects. Hurricanes hitting Puerto Rico is not new. They've been hitting Puerto Rico for its entire existence. What made Maria truly catastrophic is that all the lifeline systems, all its critical infrastructure failed simultaneously. When the power went out, the communications went out, and we lost the means to move water, and there was no longer water to be able to be pumped to provide people basic services here. Transportation systems were knocked out, and then you could move the diesel fuel in order to provide backup generators. And so systems continue to fail. The failure of the port and the surface transportation that could move things out of that port. So why Puerto Rico ended up basically completely on its knees was because the total systems failed as a result of the way the hurricane impacted on it. On 9/11, there was another part of the story that people don't know, and this is such an important one. Well, it took us many years to understand the story that Najib just laid out, that in fact, the towers were really built quite robustly and capable of withstanding the impact that they had up to a point. We tended to feel in that day that we were in fact incredibly vulnerable, incredibly fragile. 10 years after 9/11, I was able to finally get this story told. And you can, if you just go on to Google boat lift, you'll see this story. But it was that when the towers came down and people fled, they went in all directions, and many of them went south, and discovered, so for some of them for the first time, that Manhattan is indeed an island, and they couldn't get off. So they were trapped down at Lower Manhattan, and a Coast Guard lieutenant on a New York pilot boat who was there to try to support a medical evacuation of survivors, which unfortunately there were not, realized that we needed to coordinate a way to get people off the island. And he basically he issued a call over the Channel 16 to say, all available boats, if you can come help evacuate people from Lower Manhattan, come to Governor's Island, which is just off the tip of Manhattan. What was extraordinary about this was that over the next 9 hours, 500,000 New Yorkers were evacuated by boat, which is bigger than the evacuation at Dunkirk, where 339,000 British and French soldiers were evacuated over the course of 9 days. And this happened literally in real time. And what it showed was that there was this hidden capacity to actually respond to this disruption, to safely remove people from Lower Manhattan, to get them to where they needed to go, to safety or to back to their homes. And it hadn't been planned for in advance, but it was there nonetheless and was brought forth. And part of our challenge with building resilience is finding that capacity, identifying it, and empowering it if we're going to get to a better place. Now, a micro example of what looks to be an effort at resilience comes out of actually work that I did around Superstorm Sandy. So we're now moving ahead of 9/11. We got yet another structure, Goldman Sachs headquarters on 200 West Street. They're very smart people. They realized they were on the banks of the Hudson River, that the risk of Superstorm Sandy was going to be storm surge. So they did this very high-tech thing of putting 15 feet of sandbags around their entrance. Now, those could have been cash in Goldman Sachs' case, but they actually used sand, and it worked. They were the one lit building in Lower Manhattan after Sandy here, but it didn't really work, because one of the key lessons from Superstorm Sandy is you don't want to end up being an island of resilience in a sea of fragility. I'm sorry, my thing here should be an island of resilience in a sea of fragility, because ultimately Goldman Sachs makes no money by having a well-lit, dry building. It ended up not being able to get any employees to that building because the transportation systems failed. And the employees couldn't work remotely then because the power was out, and not just New York, but in Long Island and in New Jersey, parts of Western Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And so the key here with thinking about resilience is, how do we actually understand that we're part of a system of systems and manage risk within that year for building assets and operating and managing systems going first. So I made the first point already: security and safety are never ends unto themselves. We build assets and we build systems for function. And what we should be trying to secure is that function. And that function inherently will be jeopardized if there's risk to it, but its continuity is what's going to be our key aim. When it comes to man-made threats, we can't be so focused on security to them that we do it at the expense of taking into account other hazards. It's an extraordinary number that's come out of the 9/11 experience, where our focus was to try to eliminate the terrorism threat. And we invested, over 5.4 trillion in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now that number is really hard for people to process. So I tried to break it down. And when you break it down for 20 years, divided by 365, and you divide the days in the year and divide it by 24 hours, you get down to $30 million an hour, every hour, 24 hours a day for 20 years to deal with the risk of terrorism and national security threat. What could we be done, and what could have been done to better safeguard our infrastructure and our key systems with that investment if we spent money on making ourselves more resilient? These aren't either or, but we should be thinking in these kinds of terms. When it gets to resilient engineering, we need to move beyond the capacity to withstand risk by designing the capacity for systems to not just basically withstand a blow, but to fail gracefully. And again, the towers in part had that ability under this extraordinary event. They held enough for people to get out. And that was obviously an important outcome. But they also, ideally, we would be thinking in terms of that since systems may always fail at some point, can we regenerate, come back stronger after these shocks happen? And a focus on resilience translates into the need to understand a structure's dependencies and interdependencies on the external systems in its neighboring area. So we got to avoid that, again, challenge of constructing an island of resilience in a sea of fragility. We have to be able to see that anything we do is always in the context of a community, is context of the systems, and we got to look for solutions that ultimately get us to that better place. The Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, after 9/11, when I was involved with that aftermath, helping to think through this, there was almost this push here for that perfect security. Nobody will go down to Lower Manhattan unless basically they have a sense that nothing, no terrorist attack would ever be able to threaten it. Over time, the key was to think about design. How do you coexist with that risk? And even, in fact, do things that can enhance security, but don't have a bad aesthetic impact, that actually support mobility and flow. And these were some of the kinds of issues that Najib and his firm were very at the fore of bringing to the bear. At the end of the day, we can deal with risk, but we have to think about it in the context of safeguarding critical function. We've played enough on the plate here that questions will come, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Steve. Carol, do you have any questions? I don't necessarily see them.
I will have my own questions. I will mention one question that came in from the audience and encourage others to pose them in the chat. The one that I saw, which was about the roof trusses, has since disappeared. But let me preface that question with a little bit of a return to the analysis of the collapse of the towers. And Najib, I think you left us all breathless with those animations and with your narration and explanation. There are topics that people continually insist are features of the collapse. And one of these is the roof trusses. Some people may have seen the History Channel anniversary 2-hour discussion or documentary on the collapse of the towers, and Najib was featured in that. But the New York Times, in kind of real time unfolding in the analysis in the newspaper by Eric Lipton and especially James Glantz, identified the roof trusses as a point of vulnerability. And perhaps you could just speak to that, and then we can discuss some additional issues. But the question from the audience was, what about the roof truss expansion? Was there heat of the fire that pushed the against weakened columns?
Okay. So Carol, I'll take your question. I'll just rephrase it to be the floor trusses rather than the roof truss. I think that is what's intended. Yeah. There is a difference in a forensic investigation between a hypothesis, something that rationally you think is plausible and could happen, but then your investigation needs to tie it to the specific circumstances of that day and determine whether in actuality it did happen in this instance. So the fear of roof trusses comes historically from, if you've gone to suburban large superstores, you have that thin roof. Think of your typical Walmart. I don't want to stick to one particular store, but they all have these light roof with very thin trusses at the top. Firefighters have a justified fear of such roof trusses because they're very vulnerable to fires. Those are not the floor trusses that existed at the World Trade Center. So that's one. Second, are trusses theoretically more vulnerable to fire than a more traditional construction of steel beam? The answer is yes. It is simply a question of heft. Trusses have smaller members that are aggregated in a specific fashion versus a traditional beam is bulkier. So there is no question. Now, on 9/11, were the floor trusses the driver of the collapse? The answer is that for those circumstances, it turned out not. The simplest way to convince the vast majority of people is to tell them, we have photographs. Up to 1 minute before the initiation of the collapses, you see the floors level at most places except in the vicinity of the airplane impact. You see fires on those floors, and those images are perfectly horizontal. If those trusses were being weakened, it doesn't happen in the 2 seconds before the collapse. You need to see the sagging occurring over time, and then it reaches sufficient magnitude to start initiating collapse elsewhere. We do not see that. Our physics analysis confirms it. For me to go into the why not in this case, it's a long discussion. So Eric Lipton and James Glantz latched onto an idea that was frankly advanced by professors from big name universities, right? Typically listed in our top 10. They did not have access to the drawings of the World Trade Center. They did not conduct years-long investigation over it. So what they honed in is on a possible mechanism. They did not investigate whether on 9/11 it actually happened. Right.
Let me ask one additional question that fascinated me in the long discussion in the oral history capture that I participated in, and you spoke with great clarity about an extremely confusing issue that would seem clear on its face, and that's the one event versus two events, and how insurance companies could possibly have argued that two airplanes hitting two different buildings could still be one event. But maybe you could help to clarify that for our audience tonight.
It is, to me, it is a very intriguing issue. And of course, I have to take on a little bit the attitude of a surgeon. You don't think of the trauma underneath it, you intellectualize it. The one versus two event story, it's typical insurance dispute. And they called engineers to opine on the matter, which was the source of my initial puzzlement, because the word occurrence, people fight over contracts depending on the definition of the English word of occurrence. But here specifically, they knew they will have to do that, but they also asked for an independent perspective of how a scientist or an engineer would look at the matter. And a scientist looks not at the intention of the attackers or anything like that, but looks at the physical forces being exerted during those events. It's a causality chain. So really what you are thinking of as a scientist, the minute the first airplane hit the first tower, is it an uninterrupted chain of physical events that leads to the full collapse of both towers, right? Is it a domino effect? It turns out it wasn't. And again, it's not a generic answer in the absolute. It is an answer on this day of 9/11 for this specific two towers in that specific configuration. They were not. Had only one airplane collapsed, we would have only lost one tower, right? Of course, the insurance companies then argued things about the economic viability of a surviving tower. Well, we have a notable example from the '93 bombing of the World Trade Center tower, where literally an entire tower was unoccupiable because it was full of black soot throughout. All of the furniture throughout the entire height of the tower had to be taken out and literally thrown away. Repairs and refurnishing God knows how many companies existed over 102 floors of the tower. The Port Authority achieved and reopened that tower in 2 months exactly. So when you talk about economic viability, of course there is an impact, but it is not valueless. There were some interesting technical hypotheses that they also postulated. The two Twin Towers were the first commercial buildings ever tested in a wind tunnel, right? A wind tunnel, you see sometimes sports cars advertisement showing you wind flowing around a sports car. That is what a wind tunnel is. It's something where we try to recreate the impact of hurricanes on a scale model of the buildings. First time done. It is one of those innovations that as engineers, we're proud of, and to the credit of Leslie Robertson, the designer of the World Trade Center.
May I interrupt you for 1 second as I turn my camera around, because I'm sitting right next to that very model in the gallery. I'm in the light of the original wind tunnel model that comes from Lara, as on loan from now the unfortunately late Leslie Robinson. But I want to mention tonight too that that his life partner and wife Sautine C, a brilliant structural engineer herself, is on the call tonight. So we invite Sautine to pose a question or make a comment if you like. Now, okay, I'll turn that back around and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Carol. So the engineers postulate, the insurance companies experts postulated, all right, since both towers were in the wind tunnel, one was shielding the other. Maybe if only one tower survived, it would not be able to withstand hurricane. So we went through these hypothetical scenarios. Of course, they turned down to be without merit. But what was interesting is that we discovered, because 3 of the worldwide preeminent wind tunnel experts and companies and labs that all the skyscrapers in the world today rely upon came up with different measurements of the forces on these towers. So that launched something that had nothing to do with 9/11. We knew now as an industry and as scientists with NIST's involvement that we cannot have what we consider to be a reliable way to design skyscrapers be questioned because 3 of our preeminent labs came up with different answers. And ultimately, that was another investigation that lasted 2 years. And at the end of the day, we arrived at the answer. We knew exactly who was perfectly in the right and who was off and why they were off. The net result of that, we pushed standard bodies to issue a standard document that prescribes how wind tunnel testing should be done. So that is the side where engineers don't leave a disaster go untapped, if you will. There is good that comes out of these things. I know it's a harsh message, but we do learn and we do improve for the better, but we need to adjust the public's perception of what is it that we're actually fixing. And I think Steve spoke very nicely to that. What we perceive to be our vulnerability might not be where our real vulnerability lies. We do not want to be the Goldman Sachs building in a dark city.
Well, Steve, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to speak to the academic basis of your institute and how you bring in the different disciplines and how theoretical, how, do laboratories and computer modeling, how does that figure into your work?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. And first, I want to clarify, which I did put in the chat here, but the number I cited when I was talking about the relative risk of that we spent on the war on terrorism, or haven't spent on the war on terrorism, versus what we spent on hazard mitigation. I used the Iraq number. The total number, according to the Brown University's cost of war project, is 5.4 trillion. So that's the actual number between the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and what we spent on national security over 20 years. And I use as a counterexample that the total investment that FEMA spent in 2019 was $410 million to support mitigation measures, which is roughly a half day of what we spent in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan over the course of 20 years. And very kindly, Tarek Khan back here had said, the key point here was that we could fight around these numbers and so forth, but is such a yawning gap between what we think is the risk, terrorism, and the tools that we expended to deal with that risk, which is our national security apparatus, versus what we're willing to invest on mitigation measures for things that are far more probable and likely increasingly more consequential. And that's something that, so coming back to our institute, we essentially see there are 5 barriers to resilience. I've yet to find anybody actually as polarized as we are as a country who's against resilience. They're for fragility. People are not quite sure exactly what it is, but they admire it when they see it, kind of thing. As the story of 9/11, the boat lift is, story of resilience, and people, that is really cool. That's something we admired in stories like Seabiscuit, right? The horse that comes back. So we really do admire not folks necessarily live risk-free lives, but people who really cope well with risk. So why are we becoming more fragile? Well, one is that because we are hyper-connected. So again, that means when hazards play out, they now cascade in far more disruptive ways. So when we've looked at these 5 barriers, the first is we see is risk illiteracy. All right, we can't get you to focus on investing in resilience if you don't think anything's going to happen. And that means you need to understand hazards and so forth. But the more important part actually is how a hazard will play out on things that you value. We have to connect the dots for people. Najib again used the example of we connect that automatically when we get into a car. We know about the hazards associated with driving. And so we have our own sort of antenna for that. For other things like going to a big skyscraper, we didn't know that until one failed. So that's the kind of thing we have to basically raise our understanding of the hazards and how hazards can put things that we put value at risk. And that's a big science problem, understanding those issues and how they interact on it. So we need to bring scientists on that. The second core issue is when I try to point out with the example of the Newark story is we design things often for efficiency, safety when we're told to, because it's a regulation or code, but we don't design things for resilience, because resilience does require some things that actually the towers did have, some robustness and redundancy and structures and so forth. But the rewards are so heavily around efficiency that we actually often wring out redundancy, wring out robustness. And so this is an engineering challenge at a micro scale. How do we design things to be resilient, to better withstand, fail gracefully, regenerate? So it's a really interesting work our engineers are looking at there. At a more macro scale, again, to avoid that island of resilience problem, we need to think about it as an urban planning, as a regional planning. Interventions we make to accomplish one goal may in fact cause problems in another area. And so we have to bring those folks. So architects and planners need to be a key to that. Even if we have the best plans, fully informed by risk, nobody's going to do a darn thing about them if there's no incentive for them to adopt those actual best practices. And so this is where we look at both the role of economics and from the marketplace, insurance, reinsurance that drives often good behavior if it's rewarded financially, or rating markets that can set the cost of finance. And then also, of course, classic regulation, requirements that usually drive the market to come up with solutions. The fourth barrier is jurisdiction. Our challenge is we built our world often in stovepipes of specific assets, and we do it in a specific jurisdiction, but they operate across multiple jurisdictions and they're interdependent amongst each other. And so, I use the example, try getting bus people in any municipality to talk to the train people. Really hard. Never mind trying to say and talk to the water people and the energy people. And by the way, in the city of Boston, the only thing that the mayor of Boston controls that's a lifeline infrastructure is wastewater. There's a Deer Island wastewater plant. That's it. The transit system is run by the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority. The airport and the port is run by a Massport, which is a state entity. The power comes in and is actually generated in Quebec and transmitted down. So when you get into these jurisdictional issues, you often can't come up with solutions. And then we don't do good training and education to allow people to think this way. So what you can see here is the only way we're going to get to that better place, if we have scientists, engineers, understanding issues of dependency and interdependency. We have some of the top network scientists who are really looking on improving those models. But models don't make useful decisions unless you can provide visualization support. So people, some of our colleagues who do visualization in gaming and allow us to use scenarios and allow people to sort of do what ifs, ideally in a simulated environment, instead of having to keep learning from mistakes. That's another key area. And the economists who allow us to think about cost benefits and trade-offs and understand the drivers of insurance. So we had to build an institute that essentially was university-wide, that involved faculty from all 9 colleges and bring them together, not in a multidisciplinary way, but in a transdisciplinary. Multidisciplinary is you're a scientist, go off and do the science, you're a mathematician, do the math. Transdisciplinary is here's our common problem, bring your skill sets and knowledge from your discipline to work collaboratively around those solutions. And so there's so much that we can get to a better place. We can afford these solutions. We can do a much more thoughtful way, but we really have to overcome those barriers if we're going to be successful.
So we're going a little bit past our time even, and I wonder, Najib, by way of kind of closing out this broader topic of today and the world, very interesting to think about this in an academic context, hard to imagine in the political context. But Najib, as a professional engineering firm that works for individual clients as well as government clients, could you perhaps offer us some hope of some kind of bridge about how these two systems might actually work effectively for the general good rather than for their individual entities.
So it turns out, and again, 20 years of hindsight, it turns out things do improve, things do change, but always slower than you would hope for. So if there is hope in that message, please, that's the hope. The reality also is that there is a huge diversity among the stakeholders out there. There is always the leaders and there are the followers. We are lucky, both Steve and I spent a substantial amount of time with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, that I think we both share the opinion, remains even today the lead transportation agency in the United States in terms of its ability to incorporate a new thinking into how they do things on a routine manner. Doesn't mean it doesn't come with hurdles or even internal debates, internal difficulties, right? You're taking a massive institution that manages, people forget, they're saddled with, saddled might be, not sure, it is actually, saddled with infrastructure that's over 100 years old. When people think of the PATH train, those tunnels going under the river are 1903, if memory serves, right? So there is also practical limit to what you can do when you're shepherding and managing and keeping alive infrastructure that's all. The reality is, we in our lifetime, with everything that we build, we'll get to build probably a small percent of the entire infrastructure we will deal with in our lifetime, right? All of that is part of the complexity that's being managed. And there is a receptive audience. I'm seeing the commercial market following it. And you kind of see it a little bit with COVID. First it was, well, it's part of our brand. It's part of the marketing. We need to appear different than other real estate people. But at the end of the day, even though initially reluctantly, people seem to head towards we need to do the right thing. It's just that tends to be slower than you'd hope for. Steve, do you concur? What do you see?
I actually, right, this week is going to be kind of a tipping point. If we actually do the infrastructure
Bill?
Bill, and get it there. We will probably be a once now in a lifetime, not even generation, where the federal government is putting significant resources on the table, where states have more resources than they expected. And some of this is coming out of COVID's, Rescue Act. Municipalities have resources, and the private sector has enormous resources for investing it in. What I worry is that we'll just sort of dust off some backlog list and just sort of check through, repave the school parking lot, kind of thing. What we need to do here is think transformatively. And we have this rare junction where there may be real resources, but the only way in which that's going to get done is if the private and the public and some of the best practice in thinking is brought to the bear. And I think there is potential for that. It's an exciting moment that we're no longer in the fetal position, relative to thinking about investing in infrastructure. I've described our generation as much like one that's inherited our grandparents' mansion, and we decide we're not going to do any of the upkeep. People are driving by going, "Hey, it's a nice house. Look at that." And it's like, yeah, the wiring doesn't work. The plumbing is shot. The roof is shot. We are the wealthiest nation in the world, the wealthiest generation of this nation in the world. And we're saying we can't afford to upkeep and maintain and transform our inheritance. It was the blood, treasure, and ingenuity of now our grandparents and great-grandparents that built the lifeline foundations that we rely on. And we won't even do the upkeep. It is immoral. And so never mind impractical, to keep expecting this. So I think, we are at this moment, but the key will be that we really need to leverage it to take all the ingenuity and all the resources we have to actually get to that better place, to take on the risks that we're facing and do it in a more thoughtful way than we've done in the past.
Well, by way of closing, I don't know if that's an entirely optimistic or colored pessimistic view of our immediate future. I will remind our audience to come back in this continuing series for even more conversation, maybe less about engineering, but something that we've just been segueing to. Our next talk on Ground Zero master plans and the recovery 20 years out is a look back at the commercial imperative. So how did the skyscrapers affect the site in the same way that we examined how the cultural component was something that we held on to? So as Lynn Segalin leads us in moderating that panel with Bob Lieber, who was represented the city as the deputy mayor, with Ken Lewis from SOM, who was designing, managing the teams for the skyscrapers on the site, and with Chris Ward, who led the Port Authority in the years from the recovery, and Robin Panofka, who worked for Silverstein Properties in order to negotiate the realities of who was going to occupy those buildings and how would they be designed and how would the insurance pay for them. All of those realities will weigh on the site of Ground Zero, and then think about how Lower Manhattan in New York was affected as a consequence. So thank you for discussing tonight and bringing us through from the moments after to the 10 years of investigation to the continuing conversation and how the collapse impacted our understanding of buildings and of risk and hopefully of resilience. So thank you, Najib, and thank you, Stephen, for tonight. And thanks our audience for being with us and sticking with us, and come back after our short hiatus in October, on October 27th, for our next program in remembering 9/11, before, after, and since. Thank you again, Najib and Steve. Bye, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.